Okay, so welcome. My name is Kesta Graham. I'm from Common Boots Theatre. I will be your host for this evening. Although we gather tonight virtually, we would like to acknowledge that we come to you from our places of residence across the province of Ontario. It is a privilege to share stories from this land, which has been a site of human activity, including storytelling for thousands of years. Your hosts are on traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron, the Algonquin, and the Wendat peoples. The lands we are on tonight are covered by Treaty 13, the Williams Treaties, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant of 1701, and the Huron Tract Treaty of 1827. We recognize that the Ottawa area is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Ontario is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We thank you all for joining us from wherever you are on Turtle Island.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Bulmer. I am the Artistic Director of Common Boots Theatre. I'd like to welcome you to The Listening Stage. The Listening Stage is a new digital initiative of performances, readings, and workshops between Common Boots and Balance for Blind Adults. Tonight's performance is Assassinating Thomson by writer and performer Bruce Horak. We'd also like to thank ACTRA Toronto for their support for tonight's event.
Welcome, everyone. This is Deborah Gold. I'm the Executive Director of Balance for Blind Adults. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Following tonight's performance, I'd like to invite you to participate in a conversation with Alex Bulmer and Bruce Horak with your questions for each of these artists, but more on that later. Enjoy the show.
Okay, great. Let's get going. Here is Assassinating Thomson by Bruce Horak.
Good evening and welcome to Assassinating Thomson. My name is Bruce Horak, and this evening or afternoon, I guess depending on where you are, I'm going to be attempting to paint a portrait of my entire audience. And I'm going to be doing that on a wood panel here. I thought I would start this evening with a little description of what is surrounding me here in the studio. I'm joining you from Stratford, Ontario, which is where I've been sheltered since March. And I've set up a little studio here in my apartment. So in front of me is an easel with a wood panel on it. The wood panel is about, I think it's 14 inches tall by about 18 inches wide. And it's lots of fun to paint on. I'll be using acrylic paint. And if you're at home and you've got your art supplies, feel free to join along. It'll be a good time. Behind me is a mantelpiece of a fireplace. And on the mantelpiece, there are a bunch of stuffed animals, which I've had since I was a kid. From my right to my left, there's a one-eyed sock monkey. There's a chewed owl whose ears I used to suck on as an infant. There beside the owl is Truffles the bear, also one-eyed. Beside him is Chewbacca, which I've had since 1977, I think. And beside Chewbacca is a stuffed bear named Bruce that was made out of my mother's old fur coats. And then just tucked around the corner of the mantelpiece is a humble sloth who reminds me to slow down and take it easy. To my left here is a table about waist height, and on the table are my art supplies. So I've got the primary colors, yellow, red, blue. I've also got a big tub of white paint and some black paint. And then beside that are some specialty acrylics that I like to use as a finishing touch to try to attempt to capture the way that I see. And then I've also got a little thing of water and a bunch of brushes. Now, I am a legally blind or visually impaired artist. I kind of prefer legally blind because, well, it trips off the tongue, it tends to stop all questions, and it is what it says on my driver's license. Now, I've got about 9% vision is what I'm working with, so I'll be attempting to capture my audience here tonight on this beautiful wood panel. Now, I've been touring Assassinating Thomson since 2013. And I've done, oh gosh, probably close to about 200 portraits now. And the thing I've noticed in a portrait sitting is that people kind of have a difficult time relaxing, just feeling comfortable in the space. So I thought in order to help us pass the time here while I paint this portrait, and hope you have an enjoyable time and relax while you're having your portrait painted, I thought what I would do to help pass that time is to tell a story. Sunday, July 8th. 1917. It was a cold, drizzly day at the tiny cottage community of Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park, Ontario. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Tom Thomson, a 39-year-old landscape painter with remarkable promise, packed up his art supplies and his camping supplies in his dove gray canoe, paddled off across the lake, and disappeared. 8 days later, Thomson's bloated corpse surfaced in the lake. There was a gash on the left side of his head. There was blood in his ear, air in his lungs, and around his left ankle there was fishing wire wrapped meticulously 17 times. They buried the body quickly at the tiny cemetery in Canoe Lake, up by the big birch tree. The coroner arrived and pronounced it accidental drowning. But if it was drowning, why was there air in the lungs? And if it was an accident, then why the fishing wire? So what if it wasn't an accident? What if it was murder? Dun, dun, dun. Now, a few days later, Lauren Stewart Harris, one of Thomson's old friends, a mentor and colleague, arrived at Canoe Lake to see the spot that had inspired so much of Tom's work. He spent some time camping there. One night, while he was sitting around his campfire, he heard a rustling in the trees off to his left. He turned, and he saw a shadowy figure in khaki pants and plaid shirt. The mist shifts, and the figure is gone. The next day, Harris was out in his canoe, paddling on the lake, and he saw a shadowy figure in a dove gray canoe coming toward him. The mist shifts, and the figure is gone. To this day, the ghost of Tom Thomson haunts Canoe Lake. Dun, dun, dun. Ghost story, not bad. Now, people often ask me what the most difficult thing to paint is. Is it the hands, the feet, the face, the crushing reality of one's own mortality? For me, the most difficult thing to paint actually is the very first brushstroke. You see, I want this painting to be really good, and everything's going to follow that first brushstroke. So I tend to put it off for as long as possible. That's something I've been actively doing for the last 5 minutes, for those of you paying attention. Yeah, I've often wondered why, if procrastination is so bad, why does it begin with the pro? I've got some paint here on the palette, so I just have to get right into it. Okay. Moving the paint around, making it look like I'm doing something. And we'll start. There we go. Getting some paint on the canvas now. I've actually prepped this board before the show, so I just put a nice flat black surface there. I'm kind of imagining that I'm in an enormous theater and you're all here with me. Won't that be nice? I first discovered and encountered the Tom Thomson mystery when I was in high school. My high school art teacher, Connie Tusinski, had a poster of one of Thomson's paintings in the art room. It was a beautiful thing. It was a tree in front of a lake, and she told us the Thomson mystery and about how he had disappeared at Algonquin Park. And we used to imagine that the lake he had painted was the lake where his body would later surface. We're into that sort of romantic notion, I suppose. I used to love art class in high school. It was one of my favorite classes, you know, to just kind of feel the expression and allow the art to come out of me. It was beautiful. My teacher, Connie Tusinski, introduced us to a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Fantastic book that really opened my mind to all the possibilities and the potentialities that one can get into when painting. And she recommended 5 particular skills to help someone get out of the verbal mode of the brain. She talks about how the brain is broken up into the 2 modes, basically, the left and the right mode. Now, the left mode of the brain is the verbal mode, is the very quick to define things. It's constantly running in the foreground of our consciousness. And in order to paint or to draw what you actually see or feel, you have to access the right mode of the brain, the visual mode of the brain. That can be very difficult to do at times. So she recommended some skills. One of the first skills that she recommends is the observation of edges. I'll demonstrate now. So I'll hold up my left hand and I'll run my right hand just along the pinky from the base of my hand all the way up to the tip and feel just the edge. And you can do this at home. Just feel that edge. Now, the verbal mode will immediately pop in and define what it sees or feels. It says, yeah, there's your hand, there's that pinky. Oh, there's that old scar from when you were riding bikes as a kid. But you want to slow that down and just feel the edge. See, there's no word for that particular edge. It is unique in the world. Now, if I put my hands together, pinky to pinky, and feel that edge now, the question becomes, if I was to draw that edge or if I was to paint that edge, the question becomes, am I drawing? Am I painting the left hand? Am I painting the right hand? Am I drawing both? Neither. See, careful observation of edges slows the dominant verbal mode down, the right mode picks up, and time evaporates. Edges. Yeah. Now, full disclosure, as a visually impaired person, as a legally blind artist, I tend to walk into things a lot. It's true, usually head first. And this has resulted in my life in a number of concussions, which have, well, they kind of messed up my memory a little bit. So just out of frame, I'm standing on a very large drop cloth. And on the drop cloth, I've written little clues as to the story. You see, it's very difficult to paint and to talk at the same time. You're kind of using both sides of your brain. I'm having a full brain experience for you all here this evening. So if I get lost or if I forget where I am, well, I've got this drop cloth here with big words written all over. I mean, you might call it a cheat sheet. I prefer to call it a trigger map because that sounds more, oh, I don't know, 2020. I suppose there's another blind joke in there somewhere. Just adding a little white to the yellow that I've got on here as I imagine this large theater and all of you sitting there. Yeah, there's a nice rake in the audience, so it goes in a nice angle towards the top of the canvas. And we'll put maybe we'll put these stuffed animals that are behind me, we'll put them in the front row. Yeah, that's nice. Now you see, there are no lines in nature, there are only edges. And on a two-dimensional surface like this canvas, like this wood panel that I'm painting on, well, everything shares an edge with everything else. It's like when you're building a puzzle and you want to get the edge first. It helps you to define the space. Edges. Now, as I was researching the story of Tom Thomson, I discovered that Tom and I actually share a number of edges. For instance, August 5th, my birthday, Tom Thomson's birthday. Yeah, we share a birthday. And what are the odds of that, right? Like 1 in 365 or something. I found a bunch of other edges that we share. It seemed mostly banal, but this one really popped out at me. See, one of the people suspected of having killed Tom Thomson was a man named Shannon Fraser. And my girlfriend in high school's name was Shannon Fraser. It's true. Yeah, and she just recently accepted my friend request on Facebook, so you know, time. Yeah. Tom Thomson. Yeah, see, he was always broke. He was bumming around in his 20s, just like me. Eventually, he moved to Toronto, Ontario, and got himself an apartment on Yonge and Wellesley. And he went to work for an advertising agency called Grip Limited, which is where he met some of the members that would later go on to form the Group of Seven, this great group of guys. And in the summertime, Tom Thomson would go out to Canoe Lake, Algonquin Park, and he would work as a guide, showing people around the area. And he would take his little wood panels with him and his oil paints, and he would paint these beautiful landscapes. In the wintertime, he would go back to Toronto and he would set himself up shop there at Grip Limited and work with the other fellas. And one day he met Lauren Stewart Harris. Now, Lauren Harris was this rich socialite, fantastic guy, really wanted to get an art movement going in Canada. He was an artist himself. He trained over in Europe, and he said, you know, a nation will be known for its words, its deeds, and its art, but most importantly, its art. Now, Canada hadn't had an official art movement that was internationally recognized at this point. They were desperate to get something going. Now, Harris, as I said, he'd studied abroad, he'd studied all the great movements in history, and he realized, you know, if we're going to get a movement going, we really need a figurehead. And one day, Tom Thomson shows up to work at Grip Limited with a canoe paddle over his shoulder. He sits down in the middle of the office and he starts showing off the J stroke that he had just learned, a little flippy stroke that you can use at the back end of a canoe. Now, the other guys at the office are like, oh my God, this guy's so Canadian. I mean, khaki pants and a plaid shirt. Wow. Can you get more Canadian than that? So Lauren Harris made him an offer. He said, Tom, listen, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to cover your expenses for an entire year. I'm going to set you up with a studio. I'm going to give you a mentor. A.Y. Jackson's going to show you the ropes. Two of you are going to have this great studio together. Your whole expenses will be covered. You won't have to worry about working. Just pick up the paintbrush and say yes. Tom Thomson was 34 years old when he picked up a paintbrush and began to define himself as a painter. 5 years later, his body surfaced at Canoe Lake, blood in his ear, hair in his lungs, fishing wire wrapped around his ankle. Canadian art would never be the same. I'm just adding some more paint here to get the texture going. He was 34 years old when he had his call to adventure. Now, I was 34 years old when I picked up two things that would forever define me. One of them was a paintbrush, and the other was a white cane. See, I lost most of my eyesight when I was 18 months of age. I had what's called bilateral retinoblastoma, cancer of the eyes. And it was so bad in my right eye that they had to remove it right away. But in my left eye, there were just these 3 small tumors. So they flew me to Toronto and they blasted them with radiation. And by this happy accident, I have 9% vision, a real small little window through which I see the world. If you'd like a demonstration of roughly how I see, you cover your right eye with your right hand, and with your left hand, make a little tube, a little tunnel, just a tiny little straw, and look down through that. And kind of squint a bit so it refracts the light. And imagine you're looking down a straw through a murky glass of water. I see a lot of floaters and I see a lot of halos and things like that. So the image is quite distorted. I like to imagine that if there was a wall with 10 pictures on it, I'd be able to just make out a little bit of the one picture. It's about what I'm working with. But this has been my normal ever since I was a kid. I went to an integrated school in Calgary, Alberta. All of my friends were fully sighted. I had 3 older brothers who were great. You know, they taught me basically everything I know. I mean, my parents included, of course, but they taught me how to ride a bike. My older brother, Steve, taught me how to play soccer, which was amazing. I was the goalie, actually, which was a great place to put a visually impaired kid, you know, right in the goal. I didn't have to really worry about passing the ball or anything. Someone would come charging at me. I would just run fearlessly at them. Learned a whole bunch of tricks when I was in school to attempt to pretend to be fully sighted. You know, it was difficult. I had these heavy Coke bottle glasses that magnified my eyes all the time. My nickname in elementary school was Fish Face because of the way it would make my eyes bug out. You know, it's very difficult to pretend to be fully sighted when you're wearing the Hubble telescope on your face. When I was in grade 11, I got my very first contact lens, which was great because I finally got to ditch my Coke bottle glasses. I spent the whole summer practicing my fully sighted look, which is just basically a blank, wide open stare. Yeah, with a look like this, you know, I showed up for high school and I fit right in. But I learned to fake it pretty well. And learning to fake it led me directly into a life in the theater. Yeah, my college theater, my acting teacher in college, Tom Bessie, he would stand in front of the class with his pinky ring and he'd say things like, "Actors are the greatest liars in the world, and you can take that right to the bank." So I learned to fake it, got myself into theater, bummed around in my 20s, was always broke. Eventually, I moved to Toronto, Ontario, got myself an apartment near Yonge and Wellesley. And this one day, my agent calls me up and says, "Bruce, listen, there's this movie shooting in Toronto. It's called Blindness. There's an epidemic all over the world. Everybody in the world goes blind." He says, "You'd be perfect for it." He says, "There's only one problem, though. You don't really look blind. Could you look more blind?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I can blind it up." So I made my way to the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Toronto. I went to the store there and I asked the fella at the front, I'm like, "Dave, listen, can I get one of those white canes?" He says, "Absolutely." He says, "Now, wait a minute. You're 34 years old. You got 9% vision and you have never had a white cane? Man, you must get hit by a lot of cars." I'm like, yeah. Just give me the cane. How much?" He says, "First one's free, but you have to have mobility training." I'm like, "Oh, great. There I am, 34 years old, and I'm going to learn to walk again." So this woman shows up in my apartment on Yonge Street with this, my white cane, which has been sitting on the mantelpiece behind me. And she says, "Here's what you do. You just sort of unclip it like there." Now, this, of course, is the Ambutech Classic. At the bottom is a little rolling ball that moves along the ground, and it's got a rubber grip up top and a little string there to keep it safe for you. I'm holding on to this cane and I'm like, "Oh, great, this thing's going to make me a target." You know, I'd spent my whole life with my head down, my shoulders up, just avoiding the few people I could see, like a pinball on Yonge Street, you know? And I think, wow, here I am holding this cane. And she tells me, "Well, here's what you do. You have to stand up with your head up, your shoulders back, put the cane on the ground in front of you and just roll it in front of you like a radar. Now hold it," she says, "like a golf club," which is a hilarious thing to say to a blind person. Although, personally, I do love the game of golf. It's very zen, you know? Anywhere. So there I am holding this cane thinking it's going to make me a target. And then the words of Ani DeFranco came to my mind. Ani DeFranco once said that every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. So we make our way down onto Yonge Street, onto the sidewalk. I've got my head up, my shoulders back up, my cane out, moving it like a radar. And the first thing I realize is how great it feels to stand up straight. And I'm moving up the sidewalk, walking along, moving my cane like a radar, and I see people leaping out of my way, some of them directly into traffic. I get to Yonge, to the Wellesley subway station. I go down onto the platform, stand there waiting for the train. The train pulls up, the door opens, and this guy grabs my arm and pulls me onto the train. And then a woman stands up and offers me her seat. I say, no, thank you. My legs are fine. I get to Bloor and Yonge Street, and I'm standing on the corner with my cane out, and I'm just enjoying the beautiful skyscape of Toronto. And I hear this hustling and this bustling across the street, and suddenly someone grabs my arm, and it's a friend of mine, and she sees it, and she sees the cane and says, Bruce, it's Naomi. How are you? Wow. You see, I'd spent my whole life pretending to be fully sighted, moving through the world, my head up, my shoulders back, no cane, giving zero indication that I'm blind or vision impaired. And this cane, well, it asks me to see through the eye I have and not try to see through the two eyes I don't have. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this cane, and it has saved my life on a number of occasions. I'll put that back. Get out my palette again. Add a little bit more color to our canvas here. Gotta make sure to get you all in, wherever you are. There we go. Add a bit more color here. Now, another one of the great skills that Dr. Betty Edwards recommends in her book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, is the observation of negative space, which I'll demonstrate. So once again, feel your left hand with your right hand. Now the verbal mode will pop in and say, yes, that's a hand, there's 4 fingers and a thumb, and there's the palm. But we want to slow our brains down and get into the visual mode. So now, feel the space between the fingers, the space between the thumb and the index, between the index and the middle finger, between the middle and the ring, between the ring and the pinky. Just those spaces, that negative space. Now, if you were to draw just the negative space, inadvertently and most surprisingly, you would also draw the hand. It's like when Bugs Bunny runs through a wall and just leaves the outline. Negative space. Careful observation of negative space slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual mode picks up, and time evaporates. I like to think that the space between the fingers is just as important as the fingers themselves. What we leave behind. The world without us. Now, the last project that Tom Thomson was working on before he died, he called an encyclopedia of nature. He did 62 landscapes in 62 days, one a day for 62 days. It was amazing. Now, he wasn't going for a photorealistic representation of Canoe Lake and Algonquin Park. He was going for the feeling. He believed that color had an emotional connection. And I believe it. I was also quite inspired by his daily practice. Now, in 2011, a friend of mine saw me on stage in a play, and afterwards we met, we had a coffee, and I had my white cane with me, and he thought it was a prop. He thought I was kind of messing around. And then we got talking. Now, this guy and I had gone to college together. We'd known each other for years, and he had never seen me with a white cane and really didn't know how it is that I see. So I sat with Brandon one day over coffee, and I brought out a canvas and an easel and some paint, and I painted his portrait in an attempt to show him how I see. It was a remarkable connection that we had. And boy, did time evaporate. And that year, I decided I was going to make it a practice. So I painted a portrait a day for a year, 365 portraits in 1 year. I learned so much from that practice, and I still do. one of the things that really struck me was how all of the obstacles that I have as an artist, they're all internal. My external obstacles, food, clothing, shelter, well, those are all outside of myself. But those internal obstacles, those artistic ones, if I practice every day, slowly but surely, I encounter them, I embrace them, and I move forward. Every day, make something beautiful. It's quite a practice. And what I also learned was that if I take care of my art, inadvertently and most surprisingly, my art takes care of me. Now, another great tech skills is the observation of relationship. So an artist will imagine what it is that they're going to paint, will look at what they're going to paint, and then imagine a grid over it, a center line, and break that half into another half, and breaking these things down into small, manageable chunks. Then you transfer that grid that you've made in your mind onto the two-dimensional surface that you're about to paint. It helps with structure, and it helps you to understand the relationship of the objects and the people, or whatever it is, the subject that you're putting on your canvas. The observation of relationships slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual mode picks up, and time evaporates. Well, that's just the sound of me getting paint out of these jugs. I've done Assassinating Thomson in a few schools now, and that particular moment in the show always gets quite the laugh. Ain't nothing like a fart joke, I tell you. Adding a bit of red now into my canvas. I imagine some of you are wearing red out there. I've got some yellows and blues, some mixtures of all sorts here. It's coming along very nicely. The observation of relationship. Well, that leads us into the story. You see, I had a theater teacher who told me once that the actor's job is to go on stage and build relationships. That is what tells the story. So what's the story? Well, one of the people suspected of having killed Tom Thomson was a man named Martin Bletcher Jr. Martin Bletcher Jr. was a short, stocky German-American with a bad attitude. Apparently, he didn't like Tom Thomson one bit. Now, the night before Thomson disappeared, there was a drinking party happening at one of the guides' cabins. Martin Bletcher Jr. was there, and so was Tom Thomson. Now, Martin Bletcher Jr. was giving Tom the gears. He said, "Listen, pal, you are a coward." See, World War I was on at the time, and all the Canadian boys were overseas fighting. Tom says, "Well, listen, I'm no coward. I tried to enlist 3 times, but I got turned down. I got flat feet." Martin Bletcher Jr. says, "Oh, yeah, I'll bet you got real flat feet. I see you out there portaging and hiking around and carrying on in the woods. You got real flat feet. I'll bet. You're a coward." Now, the argument gets so heated that the two men have to be physically separated. The last thing that Martin Bletcher Jr. said to Tom Thomson as he stormed off into the woods, he turns and says, "You better stay out of my way if you know what's good for you." The next day, Sunday, July 8th, 1917, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Tom Thomson paddled off across Canoe Lake and disappeared. Now, he would have had to paddle right past Martin Bletcher Jr.'s place. So what if the argument from the night before picks up? Martin Bletcher Jr. calls him over to the dock. Tom paddles up. They get into this heated argument. Martin Bletcher Jr. hits him in the side of the head with a canoe paddle, killing him instantly. Bletcher then takes the body out to the middle of the Canoe Lake, dumps it, hoping it never gets found. It's possible. It's possible. Relationship. Every book that I found on Tom Thomson, as I'm doing my research, absolutely every book on him, there's a photograph of a woman. Now, in the photograph, she is standing in an ankle-length dress. She's looking right at the camera. In one hand, she's holding a fishing rod. In the other hand, she's holding some fish. And the caption reads, "Tom Thomson's girlfriend, Winnie Trainer." I find another book, same photograph, but this caption says, "Tom Thomson's fiance, Winnie Trainer." I find another book, same photograph, but this caption reads, "This is not Winnie Trainer." Right. So what do we know? Well, we know that Winnie Trainer and her family, they have a cottage up at Canoe Lake. It's actually right beside the cottage of Martin Bletcher Jr. Now, Martin Bletcher Jr., it's rumored, also carries a bit of a torch for Winnie Trainer. Love triangle? Sure, that's great. Now, beside the Trainer family cottage is the Mowat Lodge. Now, the Mowat Lodge is where Tom Thomson would go and stay in the summertime. And he would keep a room there in the summer, and he did some odd jobs around the place. And the Mowat Lodge was owned by a man named Shannon Fraser. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, 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 dun. Now, Shannon Fraser and Tom, they were pretty good friends. Tom had lent him some money a few years back for some upkeep, some upkeep on the Mowat Lodge. And one day, Shannon Fraser goes into Tom's room and he finds a letter from Winnie Trainer, the girlfriend, fiance. And the letter says, "Dear Tom, you have to get your money back from Shannon Fraser. You have got to get a new suit because we have got to get married." Now, Shannon Fraser sussed out that Winnie Trainer was pregnant. That's right. Now, they were keeping it a big secret, of course, but also Tom Thomson had been packing up some of his belongings and sending them out west. He was planning on going out there, and he wasn't telling anybody about that either. So, what if Shannon Fraser, on the morning of July 8th, confronts Tom Thomson about his plan to ditch Winnie Trainer and his unborn child, and the argument gets so heated, eventually Shannon Fraser grabs Tom, trying to shake some sense into him. Tom falls, hits his head on a fire grate, puncturing the left side of his head, killing him instantly. Shannon Fraser freaks out. What am I going to do? So he takes the body out to the middle of Canoe Lake with the fire grate, and he ties the fire grate to the leg, dumping the body and the fire grate into the water, hoping it never gets found. It's possible. It's possible. Shannon Fraser was the last person to see Tom Thomson alive on Sunday, July 8, 1917. It's possible. Now, Winnie Trainer, she and her family actually packed up from Canoe Lake after the funeral, and they went down to the States for about a year. So what if Winnie Trainer was pregnant? What if she went down to the States, she had the baby, she gave it up for adoption? The records have been lost, so it's possible. It's possible. A little more paint on the palette. My art teacher often told us that if you're going to get into painting, get prepared to waste a lot of paint. There we go. I think I might even put some theatrical lighting up in the top left and right corner of the painting here. Because, of course, gotta have some tech. There we go. Beautiful. Now, the reason that I have any eyesight at all is actually because of my father. When I was diagnosed with bilateral retinoblastoma, the treatment at the time was to remove the eye completely, the fear being that the cancer on the retina was going to go up the optic nerve to my brain. Now, as I said, it was so bad in my right eye that they had to remove it, but my left eye, there were just 3 small tumors. My father stepped in at that point and said, "Can you save some of his eyesight? Any of it at all?" So Mom and I packed up and we flew to Toronto, and the doctors there blasted my left eye with radiation. They're going to kill the tumors. Now, they figured what would happen would be that scar tissue would develop over the retina, and I might be able to see maybe some shadows and some light, and that would be about it. But by a happy accident, a little window was left unscarred through which I can see the world. Yeah. Got to say, I'm pretty grateful to my father for that. Now, my dad, Carl Joseph Horak, was diagnosed with terminal cancer, esophageal cancer, in 2003. Excuse me, 2002. And they gave him about a year to live. And in that last year with my dad, we had a lot of really amazing conversations. He was a remarkable guy, an amateur cartoonist, English teacher, lover of drama and art. One of my dad's most popular cartoons, as I said, he was an English teacher, and he published a cartoon in the Alberta Teachers Association newsletter. And the cartoon is of school administrator sitting behind a large desk, and in front of him is Albert Einstein. And the school administrator is saying, "E equals MC squared is very interesting, Mr. Einstein, but what do you coach?" He had a fantastic sense of humor. One of the things my dad left me with one of his great pearls of wisdom before he passed away. He said, "Perhaps we can get to a point where we no longer grieve what is lost, but we celebrate what remains." Dad was talking about my brothers and my mom and I and how we would go on without him and how he wanted to be remembered, not in moments of grief, but in moments of celebration. And I realized at that point that I had spent my whole life grieving 91% vision that I don't have, and clinging to 9% like a life raft, trying to hide it. And I wondered, could I celebrate this vision? And who better to celebrate it with than my father? So I decided I was going to paint his portrait. Now, I was on the road at the time, and I spent quite a bit of that time practicing portrait painting. And I got back to Calgary eventually to sit with my dad. Now, he had been through his chemotherapy and his radiation treatment, and he didn't look like himself anymore. He looked like he'd aged about 30 years. Now, I think of my art as a way to mark time. And that was not a time I particularly wanted to mark. August 5th, my birthday, 2003, my father passed away. I was in Saskatoon at the time, and I got on an airplane and I flew back to Calgary for the funeral. And the whole way there, I was thinking about this notion of celebration and how I was going to do that in the midst of this grief. And I got together with my brothers and my mom. And as I said, I have 3 older brothers, and when the 4 of us get together, it doesn't take long before one of us starts laughing and then the other 3 will go, usually at inappropriate times, like when you're sitting in church. And the laughter would go, and then the laughter would turn to tears, and the tears would turn to laughter. It'd be really hard to tell where one ends and one begins. A few years later, when I was in the midst of my portrait painting, a friend asked if I'd ever done a portrait of my dad, and I said, no, I hadn't. So I got a blank canvas and set up my easel and paints, and I was standing in front of this blank canvas. I was going to paint it from memory. Now, it had been 5 years since I'd seen my father, and as I stood in front of this blank canvas, I realized I could not remember what he looked like. Another one of Dr. Betty Edwards' great tricks for getting into the visual mode is the observation of shadows and light. I'll demonstrate again on my hand. So if you run your right hand over your left, you'll feel high points and low points, the deep ridges and valleys, the high crests. And in those deep ridges, there's a multitude of tone. And within the high points, there are a multitude of tones. And it can be very difficult to tell where one ends and one begins. Careful observation of shadow and light slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual mode picks up, and time evaporates. So I'm standing in front of a blank canvas, trying to remember what my father looked like. It was a devastating realization that his image had slipped from my brain. I had wonderful moments of memory, though, just little flashes of insight. And something came to me at that time. It was this moment from when I was a kid, and it was usually my job to go downstairs into Dad's study while he was marking papers after school. And it was my job to go and tell him that dinner was ready. And I remember walking into that study and just the smell of it. Dad was a comic collector. And in his study, floor to ceiling, he had old comic books and comic pages, and the smell of that old newsprint took me right back there. And then I also remembered the smell of his roll-top desk. This beautiful old hardwood desk that he had. It smelled like pipe smoke at times. So I started to mix up some color to capture that emotion, find the connection in color. And it just started to come to me. I just started to paint. I wasn't going for a photorealistic, accurate presentation of any kind. I was just looking for a feeling in it. And I painted and painted and painted, and I took a step back, and I saw a roll-top desk begin to emerge on the canvas. And at the roll-top desk, there was a figure hunched over. So I started to paint the hunch, just capturing the feeling and mixing up the colors that would go with that hunch. And I realized that Dad's horrible 1980s sweater was starting to emerge on the canvas. Clashing colors there. And the figure started to emerge, and there was jet black hair graying at the temples, the shape of his cheek, his glasses, a bit of a smile. I painted that portrait for hours and hours, and I just loved it. And it was like Dad was in the room with me. It was a beautiful haunting, a wonderful way to mark the time. Yeah. I think ghosts can be beautiful. They can also be super creepy. Here's a story. Back in 2013, when I was creating Assassinating Thomson, I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia, in what the Vancouverites charmingly refer to as a garden suite, a tiny basement apartment. Tiny. It was a bachelor suite, really, everything in one room. It was just tiny. At the front of the apartment, there were 2 sliding glass doors that you would open up, and you'd be right on the street, right there. You'd hear people going by at all times of the day and night. So you'd lock the glass sliding doors, and just to be sure, you'd put a stick right in the rail at the bottom in case somebody broke the lock. They wouldn't be able to open the door. To the right of me there, just in the same room, there was a lovely, charming IKEA couch that folded out into the lovely, charming, and slightly uncomfortable IKEA bed. Now, late one night, I'm lying in bed, I've got my back to the room, and I'm in that beautiful liminal space between waking and sleeping. And I hear the glass doors start to open. I think, did I forget to put the stick in? And I feel a cool breeze on the back of my neck as though the window was open, and then there's a pause in the breeze as though someone has stepped into the room, and I feel them pressing against the side of the bed. I start to very slowly roll over, and I open my eye, and I see khaki pants and a plaid shirt, and I wake up screaming. The room is empty, but there's a feeling like a presence. The next day, I'm on my way to the UBC, where I'm rehearsing Assassinating Thomson, and I'm on the bus, and I'm reading my book on Tom Thomson, and I read that the last thing he was seen wearing was khaki pants and a plaid shirt. Later that day, during rehearsal, I take a break, and I open up my email, and I get an email from Tom Thomson. You see, someone has started an online account as Tom Thomson. They've got a whole presence out there. It's called TT Last Spring, and he tweets every day as though he's Tom Thomson, saying things like, oh, headed up to Canoe Lake today, gonna hang out with Shannon Fraser, #awesome, or whatever. He's pretending it's 1917, and the Twitter feed goes all the way up until July 8th, and then it stops, and then he starts it all again as though he's back in his last spring. I get this email from Tom Thomson. 3 words, I'm following you. It's like I was being haunted. Now, people take this whole Tom Thomson mystery very seriously. I think Winnie Trainor now has a Twitter account. Shannon Fraser's now got a Twitter account. Everybody's on board. And every year there's another book, there's another theory about how Tom Thomson met his grisly demise. Well, one of the most recent books I read was called Tom Thomson's Last Bonfire. And in it, I think they placed the blame for the murder of Tom Thomson squarely on a large fish that he was out trying to catch. Oh yeah, no, the theories, the ideas, they go deep. They go very, very deep. Because after all, the ghost still haunts the park. Yeah. Although technically, his ghost shouldn't be haunting Canoe Lake, because technically his body isn't buried at the tiny cemetery of Canoe Lake. Technically, his body is buried in Leith, Ontario, in the family plot. You see, back in 1917, after they buried the body at the tiny cemetery at Canoe Lake, Winnie Trainor gets a postcard from Thomson's parents saying, "Dear Winnie, could you please make arrangements to have Tom's body exhumed from the cemetery at Canoe Lake and shipped to Leith, Ontario?" So Winnie Trainor contacts an undertaker by the name of Churchill, who shows up at the Canoe Lake Cemetery around 9 o'clock. He's got himself a lantern and a shovel, and by midnight, he's done. In the morning, they load a sealed metal coffin onto the train and ship it off to Leith, Ontario, where it remains unopened to this day. But here's the thing. Mark Robinson, who was a ranger at the park, he helped load that coffin onto the train, and he said there is absolutely no way that one man could have done what he claims to have done in the time that he done it. Churchill, one guy, he goes up to the cemetery at 9 o'clock, with a shovel and a lantern. Now, this one guy digs down 5-6 feet of dirt all by himself. Then he jumps down into that 5-6 foot hole all by himself. He opens up the wooden box all by himself. He moves a gelatinous mass out of that hole all by himself. He puts it into a metal coffin. He seals it up all by himself. Then he fills in that 5-6 foot hole with dirt all by himself in 3 hours. Yeah. It's possible. Now, Mark Robinson helped load that metal coffin onto the train in the morning, and he said, it's not heavy enough. There's no way there's a body in that coffin. So he goes up to the cemetery to have a look around, and he says, there's not enough dirt moved around here, maybe enough for a gopher hole. So what if? What if Churchill, the undertaker, knew that he had a grisly task ahead of him? So when he gets to the cemetery, he tells everyone else, yeah, you guys, you go back to the lodge, I can handle this. As soon as they're gone, he opens up that metal coffin, he fills it up with some rocks and some dirt, and has himself a 3-hour nap. It's possible. No one in Leith, Ontario has opened up that metal coffin, where it remains to this day. So, the ghost still haunts the park. Now, the fifth trick to get out of the verbal mode and into the visual is the observation of gestalt, or the big picture. So what you do is take a big step back and have a look at the entire canvas at once. Now, for someone like myself with extreme tunnel vision, this is very difficult. Because as I said, I can only see small parts at a time, so I really have to scan the whole thing. Seeing the entire thing in one go, it's just not going to happen. But everything sort of becomes hot mush for me, which is appropriate, I suppose. But one really great part about that is that as I take a step back, different parts of the canvas start to take on new meaning. And I start to see different images, different things coming into focus and taking on importance. The big picture. Now, the ghost story of Tom Thomson, well, it's been around since 1917, ever since Lauren Harris first saw the ghost. And it gets told at campfires every year. And there's ceremonies, and there's a couple of kids' camps up there, and they sit around the campfire and they talk about the ghost of Tom Thomson. Now, this story has been around, as I said, since 1917. In 1956, 4 guys decided they were going to go up to the cemetery and find out once and for all whether or not there was a body up there. So these 4 guys, they get some beers and they head up to the cemetery and they're digging around with shovels and they're finding nothing until they find a metal box. And in the a wooden box. And inside the wooden coffin, they find a skeleton. Now, the skull has a hole on the left side of the head and some teeth missing. And these 4 guys freak out. They're like, yeah, we did it. We found Tom Thomson. The ghost still haunts the park. This is great. Now, the government comes along to remove the remains to examine them officially. And why they didn't arrest those 4 guys, I got no idea. But the government comes back and says, no, those are not the remains of Tom Thomson. Those are the remains of a 20-year-old First Nations male. But here's the thing. One of the guys who dug up that skeleton was a doctor. And when he saw the remains, he said, no, those are the remains of a 40-year-old Caucasian male. Tom Thomson was 39 years old when he disappeared at Canoe Lake. Now, they have since returned the remains to that cemetery, which is where they are today, which is also why the ghost still haunts the park. Yeah. Now, photographs of that skull have eventually made their way to a forensic specialist who reconstructed the face that goes along with that skull. And it is unmistakably the face of Tom Thomson. Upon closer examination, you will notice that the hole in the left side of the skull there and the teeth missing, well, this couldn't possibly have been made from the edge of a canoe paddle or a fire grate, or even the edge of a canoe for that matter. No, you see, the hole in the left side of the skull is a bullet hole, as though the person who shot him was standing above and behind him. The bullet went in through the side of his head and took some teeth out on its way out. Could he have been shot? It's possible. It's possible. I take a step back, different parts come into focus and take on new meaning. When I was back in Calgary in 2013, before I began my big tour of Assassinating Thomson, I went to the Glenbow Museum. Now, the Glenbow Museum, I have to give them real credit here because they actually commissioned me a number of years ago to write a complete history of Canadian art. You know, they wanted a 45-minute little song and dance piece for the kids. And it was at that point when I discovered so many of these great stories about Canadian artists, you know, and I learned the murder mystery of Tom Thomson, and I learned about Emily Carr and her wackiness, you know. Although I met this curator named Kyla Lagarde who told me all the great scandals of Canadian art history. And she said, listen, if you're going to do anything about Emily Carr, you have to be very careful. You know, she's practically a saint. So I wrote a little musical number between Emily Carr and her pet monkey. And when I showed it to the Glenbow Museum, they said, well, you know, some of this stuff is a bit rough, you know? I mean, these Canadian artists, they had pretty tough lives. You got any idea how hard it is to be an artist in Canada? Maybe you should just tell the good stuff. So I had to cut some of my rougher material, but I've always kept these stories of Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven in the back of my head. Eventually it evolved into Assassinating Thomson. So I went back to Calgary to the Glenbow to have a look around, and I went to the front desk and I said, hey, listen, have you got any Tom Thomson paintings? I'd really love to have a look. Maybe there's a clue in there. And she said, oh yeah, we got a Thomson, it's upstairs. And as I was going up the stairs at the Glenbow, she shouted after me. The woman at the front desk shouts, she says, hey, if you want to know who did it, I'll tell you. It was the girlfriend. I'm like, what, Winnie Trainor? She says, yep. She found out that Tom Thomson was planning on ditching her, and she went blamity blam. That's what I would have done. She says, great minds think alike, you know. They haven't seen my ex-husband in years. Seriously, you can't write this stuff. Could it have been the girlfriend? I suppose it could have been Winnie Trainor. Could have been Winnie Trainor's father. I mean, that's a possibility, right? As you take a step back and you start to see other ideas, other potentialities in the mix. Could have been Winnie Trainor's father. Hugh Trainor could have shot Tom Thomson if he'd have found out that Tom was planning on ditching his daughter. The other theory, of course, is that it may have been poachers. There were a lot of poachers in the woods at Canoe Lake. Could have been an accident. Someone could have shot Tom Thomson by accident. Oh, one of the other really great theories is that it wasn't Tom Thomson after all. You see, when the body surfaced 8 days after he disappeared, he'd been in the water for over a week. The body was badly decomposed. Could have been anyone, right? Khaki pants and a plaid shirt. That was like 49% of the Canadian population at that time. Could have been anyone. So what if this mysterious individual was killed, and then word got out? Tom was out in the woods. He was hiking. Maybe he was injured or something. And he hears on the wind, hey, they found Tom Thomson. Tom Thomson's dead. Now, Tom had been planning on going out west. He planned on starting a whole new life. He thought, this is my opportunity. So he packs up his things and he heads out to Alberta. He changes his name. He lives a whole other life. Eventually, he gets an email account and he emails me. He says, I'm following you. Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. Now, here's a theory. If we're going to step really far outside here, here's a whole other theory. In 1917, Lawrence Stewart Harris was in Barrie, Ontario, training Canadian soldiers how to shoot. Now, I know what you're saying. Barrie, Ontario, Canoe Lake, that is too far for a bullet to travel. But what if? What if Lawrence Harris got on a train with a bullet? He took that bullet to Canoe Lake and he put that bullet in the head of a landscape painter with remarkable promise. Now, why? Why, in God's name, would Lawrence Stewart Harris kill Tom Thomson? Well, you see, Lawrence Harris wanted to get an art movement going in Canada. Now, he'd studied all the great movements of history, and he knew if you want to get a movement, you got to get a martyr. Blamity blam, Thomson would have been great. Perhaps he was jealous. You see, Lawrence Harris desperately wanted to be the rock star of Canadian art, and then here comes along Tom Thomson, 39 years old, already shooting to stardom. Was it jealousy? Perhaps. But after Tom had died, Lawrence Harris bought a rail car and he invited some of the guys from Grip Limited to join him. And they eventually formed the Group of Seven. They would go out in this rail car into Algoma and Algonquin Park, and they would paint in the style of Tom Thomson. And if you look at Harris's work at the time, it very clearly resembles Tom Thomson's work. Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven, an international scene. It had become politically motivated. It had gone from murder to assassination. It's possible. It's possible. Now, they say that Lawrence Harris was haunted by the ghost of Tom Thomson. Eventually, Lawrence Harris would stop signing his work. Now, it's said that Harris stopped signing his work because he didn't want the canvas to be valued on the signature. He wanted it to be valued for the painting. But others say no. Lawrence Harris stopped signing his work because every time he tried, it came out Tom Thomson. Dun dun dun. Was he haunted? Perhaps. Now, Lauren Stewart Harris was born in Brantford, Ontario. Now, Brantford, Ontario also happens to be the home to the W. Ross Macdonald School for the Blind. Now, in 2013, I was invited by the W. Ross Macdonald School to speak to their students. Now, as I said, I went to an integrated school. I didn't have a lot of blind or vision impaired friends growing up. And honestly, the thought of a whole school full of blind and deafblind kids kind of freaked me out. I didn't know what I could possibly say to them. So I decided I would just tell my story. And it was wonderful. They had really great questions and they were so engaged. And on my way out, as I was leaving the school, this young fella comes up to me and he says, "Hey, I see just like you. I got about 10% vision. I got to wear these really heavy glasses and it's hard, because I'm not blind enough to be blind and I'm not sighted enough to be sighted." And I looked that kid right in the face and I said, "You know what, man? No one sees like you. No one sees like you." For my 39th birthday, I took a trip with some friends to Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. I wanted to see the spot where he painted. I wanted to see the grave. I was hoping to see the ghost. And on our way into the park, we stopped at the ranger station. And I asked the ranger, I'm like, "Hey, can you tell us where Thompson's grave is?" He says, "Nope, it's on private property. You can't go anywhere near it. I can't tell you." Now, I look around the ranger station at this point, and I see on the bookshelf, I see a copy of Roy McGregor's book, Northern Light, which I had just finished reading. And I knew that on the inside cover of that book, there's a hand-drawn map of Canoe Lake and a little X where the grave was. So while my friends distract the ranger, I go over to the bookshelf, I take out my phone, and I snap a picture of that map. Then I quickly email Roy McGregor $5 for copyright infringement. The next day, we're paddling around and we ditch our canoe and we go out into the woods and we're following along on this really bad hand-drawn map. We get completely lost. So after about 45 minutes, we decide we're going to head back to the canoe. And on our way back to the canoe, this young fella pops out of the woods. He's got a life jacket on and a canoe paddle. And we're like, "Hey, man, can you tell us where Tom Thomson's grave is?" And the kid's like, "Yeah, absolutely. You just go down the path. You'll see a pile of dirt with a stick in it. That's the trailhead. You follow the trailhead up to the top of the hill. There'll be a big birch tree. That's the graveyard." Right, perfect. So we follow the trail, pile of dirt. There's the stick. Follow the trailhead. And at the top of this hill is an enormous birch tree. Huge. You can't even get your arms around it. By the birch tree, there's a white picket fence. Old graveyard with a couple of old broken up slabs of grave that you can't even really read the inscription on anymore. And around the corner, just over in the dirt, is a white cross, unmarked. That is the grave of Tom Thomson. So I sit, expecting my muse to arrive, my big epiphany. I get nothing. Now there's a really wonderful word that describes our brain's ability to make connections, to see concrete images in the abstract. It's pareidolia. I love this word, pareidolia. I think of looking up at a cloud in the sky and seeing a face or maybe a canoe or something. Pareidolia. Cloud spinning, I call it. It's wonderful. Pareidolia. So here's a little pareidolia for you. Canoe Lake, 1917. Winnie Traynor gets a telegram from Tom Thomson's family asking if she can make arrangements to have Tom's body exhumed. So she contacts the undertaker by the name of Churchill. And the two of them go together to the Canoe Lake Cemetery. And on the walk over, Winnie is crippled by grief. You see, she may have been his fiancée. She may have been carrying his unborn child. We don't know. But we do know that she loved him. For years afterwards, after he passed away, she would go up to the tiny cemetery and she would lay flowers on the grave. And I wonder if on that walk, she thought about how in just a few years, she would not remember what he looked like. You see, if you want to wipe a person from history, you stop telling their story. And what makes a good story? Mystery. So Winnie Trainor and Churchill, the undertaker, they arrive at the cemetery. Winnie Trainor, crippled by grief, she convinces Churchill to open up that metal coffin, and inside that metal coffin, put some rocks and some dirt. Now, as I said, the last project that Tom Thomson was working on, his Encyclopedia of Nature, 62 landscapes in 62 days. 20 of those landscapes have never been found. So what if they fill the metal coffin with rocks and dirt, and Winnie Trainor places 20 of Tom Thomson's landscapes on top, and they seal it up, and they ship it off to Leith, Ontario, where it remains to this day. See, now, while Tom's life was incomplete, now so too would his art be, and his story would go on, and the ghost would forever haunt the park. Every story changes with the telling and by the teller. And if you can't remember the story, well, just make it up. I do. Take a step back. Wow, it is a full audience tonight. Gosh, what memories. A number of years ago, I asked a painter friend of mine, I said, how do you know when a painting is done? And he said, Bruce, that is the problem that every artist struggles with. You see, there's a conversation that happens between the painter and the subject, the canvas, and the source. And as you get into this conversation, time will evaporate. And bits and pieces will pop out that you had no idea. You'll discover these wonderful, happy accidents. They will emerge. And it's your job as the artist to show up and express this conversation. If you go to bed at night and you close your eyes and you see that painting, well, some part of the conversation has yet to be explored and expressed. And you have to go back in and express it. That's your job. So you go back in and you add the halos and the refractions of light. And while this is not a photorealistic representation, it is the feeling of being on stage in front of an audience and painting their portrait and seeing the gorgeous light that emanates from them. And when you go to bed at night and you see something else, anything at all, then maybe, just maybe, it's finished. Thank you very much for joining me here today for Assassinating Thomson. I've been Bruce Horak, and you've been great. And huge thanks to Common Boots and Balance for Blind Adults and for hosting this wonderful event. I'm going to turn this around and I'll try to describe it as best I can. My inspiration this evening for this painting was the over 200 audience portraits that I've painted since starting this show. And so I tried to imagine that you were all in the theater with me. And I'll turn this now. It is a blast of color. There's a large mass of people, individuals, filling the canvas in a large rectangle. In the top right and the top left corner, there are beams of light. And there's golden light. I've used iridescence. It doesn't show up particularly well on this particular canvas. Oh, there we go. You can see a little bit of that iridescence. The gorgeous rays emanating from this wonderful audience. And there you have it. Thank you so much.